The pride of humanity burned. Commander Nix Blackthorn watched from the bridge of her vessel as the massive colony ship's engines failed, its hull breached in dozens of places by Centauri weapons fire. 10,000 civilians, men, women, and children, were aboard that ship, fleeing from the expanding alien empire. And she had failed them. Shields at 12%, her tactical officer reported, voice steady despite the chaos. Hull integrity compromised on decks 3 through 7. The Defiant, her small corvette-class warship, had fought well beyond its capabilities, drawing fire from 3 Centauri cruisers to give the civilian vessel a chance to escape. But it hadn't been enough. The aliens' energy weapons had proven far more effective than intelligence had suggested. Status of the enemy flagship? Nix demanded, gripping her command chair as another blast rocked the ship. Their shields are down to 40%, Commander. Whatever that new resonance cannon did, it hurt them. A ghost of a smile crossed Nix's face. At least her engineers' desperate modifications had proven worthwhile. The Centauri weren't invincible after all. The main viewscreen showed the enemy flagship in all its biomechanical glory, a massive vessel that seemed to have been grown rather than built, its crystalline hull plates shifting and realigning like scales on some vast spaceborne serpent. And at its helm was Queen Visara herself, the legendary warrior monarch of the Centauri who had led their expansion across 3 sectors of space. All power to weapons, Nix ordered. If we're going down, we're taking that flagship with us. Her crew responded without hesitation. They had all volunteered for this mission, knowing it was likely one way. The Defiant's engines growled as they pushed beyond safety limits, carrying them straight toward the heart of the enemy fleet. The next few minutes were chaos. The Defiant's guns blazed, pouring everything they had into the Centauri flagship's weakened shields. Return fire carved deep gashes in their hull. Nix felt the deck plates buckling beneath her feet as structural integrity began to fail. But they had succeeded in one thing, they had the enemy's full attention now. The civilian ship was forgotten as the Centauri concentrated their fire on this single human vessel that dared to challenge their queen. Direct hit on their bridge, the tactical officer shouted triumphantly. Their command center is exposed. Before Nix could capitalize on this advantage, a brilliant beam of energy lanced out from the flagship, cutting through the Defiant's remaining shields like they weren't there. The bridge exploded in a shower of sparks and debris. Nix was thrown from her chair, slamming hard against a bulkhead as emergency force fields snapped into place around hull breaches. When she regained consciousness moments later, half her bridge crew was dead. The others were unconscious or wounded. Through the flickering viewscreen, she could see the Centauri flagship was also badly damaged, its crystalline hull cracked and leaking atmosphere in several places. Engineering to bridge, a voice crackled through the damaged comm system. Commander, we've lost containment on the main reactor. We have maybe 5 minutes before it goes critical. Nix pulled herself to her feet, ignoring the sharp pain in her ribs. Begin evacuation procedures. Get everyone to the escape pods. What about you, Commander? I'm going to make sure these 5 minutes count. She limped to the weapons station, bringing the resonance cannon online one final time. The weapon was unstable, likely to burn out after a single shot, but that was all she needed. The Centauri flagship loomed before her, its wounds glowing with otherworldly energy. Through the damaged sections of hull, Nix could see figures moving, including one that had to be Queen Visara herself, her distinctive crystalline crown catching the light of nearby stars. Nix took careful aim at the flagship's exposed command center. For Earth, she whispered, and fired. The resonance cannon's beam struck true, shattering the remaining crystal armor around the Centauri bridge. Nix had a brief glimpse of Queen Visara being thrown backward by the impact before her own console exploded, sending her crashing to the deck once more. Warning klaxons blared as the reactor reached critical levels. Nix dragged herself toward an escape pod, knowing she was out of time. The last thing she saw before the pod launched was the Defiance reactor detonating, the explosion catching both ships in its fury. Her small pod was thrown clear by the blast wave, tumbling end over end through space. Through its small viewport, Nyx watched pieces of both vessels scatter across the void. The Centauri flagship was largely intact but clearly crippled, drifting powerless in space. As consciousness faded, Nyx's last thought was of satisfaction. She had bloodied the nose of the mighty Centauri Empire. Shown them that humanity wouldn't go quietly into the night. It would have to be enough. She didn't see the tractor beam that caught her pod, drawing it into the damaged flagship's emergency bay. Didn't see the tall, crystalline figure of Queen Visara herself watching as her warriors cut open the pod, dragging out the unconscious human commander who had very nearly killed her. The Queen's silver eyes narrowed as she studied her enemy's face. "Take her to the brig," she ordered. "When she wakes, I want to know how her people created a weapon that could pierce our defenses." The story was just beginning. The interrogation chamber aboard the Centauri flagship felt oddly alive. Its crystalline walls pulsed with bioluminescent light, casting shifting shadows across Commander Nyx Blackthorn's face as she stood defiantly before Queen Visara. 3 days of questioning had yielded nothing but stony silence. "Your resilience is admirable," Visara said, her silver eyes studying the human with growing curiosity. "But ultimately futile. The resonance weapon you used against my ship, my engineers will eventually unlock its secrets." "They're welcome to try," Nyx replied, her voice hoarse but steady. "Though I doubt they'll survive the attempt." The Queen's crystalline crown chimed softly as she tilted her head. "Explain." "The weapon was unstable. A prototype. Half the engineers who worked on it died during testing. We knew it was a one-shot weapon that would destroy itself, and probably its users. We considered it an acceptable cost." "To kill me?" Visara's tone held genuine surprise. "To protect our people." Nyx met the Queen's gaze unflinchingly. "You've conquered 3 sectors, displaced millions. Did you think we wouldn't fight back?" Before Visara could respond, the ship shuddered violently. Warning klaxons blared as emergency lighting bathed the chamber in crimson. "My queen!" A warrior burst into the chamber. "We've lost containment on the primary crystal matrix. The damage from the human weapon is spreading through the ship's neural network." Visara's scales shifted color, darkening with concern. "Evacuate all non-essential personnel. Begin emergency shutdown procedures." "It's too late," the warrior reported. "The matrix is cascading. We have minutes at most before total systems failure." The Queen turned to Nyx, her expression unreadable. "It seems your weapon was more effective than even you knew. The resonance patterns are destroying my ship from within." Another violent tremor rocked the chamber. Crystalline shards rained from the ceiling as support structures began to fail. Nyx stumbled, caught off guard as her restraints suddenly deactivated. "What are you doing?" she demanded as Visara grabbed her arm. "Ensuring we both survive," the Queen replied. "My warriors are loyal to the death. They'll stay with the ship. But I must live to protect my empire, and you're the only one who might understand enough about this weapon to help me save what's left of my flagship." "Why should I help you?" "Because the alternative is dying here. The escape pods are coded to my biosignature. You need me as much as I need you." Another explosion rocked the ship. Nyx could hear the distinctive sound of crystal fracturing throughout the vessel's structure. The Queen was right, neither of them would survive without the other. "Fine," she growled. "Lead the way." They ran through corridors that were literally coming apart around them, crystal shards slicing through the air like shrapnel. Nyx was impressed despite herself by Visara's speed and grace. The Queen moved like a predator, all lethal efficiency. They reached the emergency bay just as a massive crack split the deck beneath their feet. Visara shoved Nyx into the nearest escape pod, diving in after her as the ship's structure began to collapse. The pod's launch was violent, systems barely responding to Vasara's commands as they shot away from the dying flagship. Through the viewport, Nix watched the massive vessel shatter like a broken mirror, fragments spinning away into the void. "Your crew," she said quietly. "They could have evacuated. They died with honor, protecting their queen." Vasara's voice held both pride and grief. "As yours died protecting their people." An alarm chirped from the pod's small control panel. "We're caught in the gravity well of a rogue planetoid," Vasara reported. "The pod systems are too damaged to break free." Nick studied the readings. "That's not a planetoid. It's a moon-like habitat, artificial construction disguised as a natural body. Probably an automated mining operation." "You're familiar with such things." "I was a mining engineer before joining the military. Those energy signatures are unmistakable." Nix frowned at the data. "But this one's been abandoned for decades at least. No active systems showing." The pod shuddered as they hit the upper atmosphere, heat building around their small craft. Vasara worked the controls with growing frustration. "Navigation is offline. Stabilizers failing. This landing will not be pleasant." "Story of my life lately," Nix muttered, bracing herself as the surface rushed up to meet them. The impact was brutal. Nix's head slammed against the bulkhead, her vision going dark at the edges. When it cleared, she found the pod had come to rest at an angle, half buried in loose regolith. Emergency lighting flickered weakly. Vasara lay crumpled against the control panel, dark fluid seeping from a gash in her crystalline skin. The queen's breathing was labored, her scales had lost their lustrous sheen. Nix could have left her there. Could have searched for a way off this rock alone. But something made her reach out, checking Vasara's wounds with careful fingers. The queen's eyes fluttered open. "Why help your enemy?" "Because right now, we have bigger problems than being enemies." Nix gestured to the pod's broken viewport, where strange shapes moved in the perpetual twilight outside. "We're not alone here. And I don't think the locals are friendly." Vasara tried to rise, then fell back with a hiss of pain. "My leg is broken. The crystal matrix that forms my skeletal structure is shattered. Then I guess you'll have to trust me to keep us both alive." Nix began gathering what supplies had survived the crash. "At least until we figure out how to get off this rock. Trust a human." Vasara's laugh held no humor. "The universe has a cruel sense of irony. Tell me about it." Nix checked the power cells in a salvaged weapon. "Ready to see what's out there?" The queen's silver eyes met hers. "Do I have a choice?" "There's always a choice. You can stay here and die, or work with me and maybe live." "Your call, your majesty." After a long moment, Vasara nodded. "Then let us see what fate has in store for us, Commander Blackthorn." Together, unlikely allies born of desperation, they prepared to face whatever awaited them in the artificial twilight of their prison moon. The abandoned mining facility loomed before them, a twisted maze of corroded metal and broken dreams. Nix supported Vasara's weight as they made their way through the derelict corridors, every shadow concealing potential threats. The queen's crystalline form was surprisingly light, but the constant contact between them made both women uncomfortable. "These markings," Vasara observed, gesturing to faded symbols on the walls. "They're not human." "Syndicate script," Nix confirmed. Criminal cartels used to run autonomous operations like this before the war. Strip mining asteroids and moons, using slave labor. She paused at an intersection, checking for movement. "Looks like they abandoned this one in a hurry." A distant screech echoed through the facility, causing both women to tense. "Whatever drove them out is still here," Vasara noted grimly. They found temporary shelter in what had once been a control room. Nix helped Vasara onto a broken console before securing the entrances. The queen's leg was badly damaged, crystal shards protruding at unnatural angles. I need to set this properly, Nick said, examining the injury. Your biology, how does it work? Vasara's silver eyes narrowed. You expect me to reveal Centauri's secrets? I expect you to want to walk again. Nyx met her gaze steadily. Look, I know your people's crystal matrix acts as both skeleton and nervous system. I've seen enough dead Centauri to understand the basics. But I need to know how it heals. The queen was quiet for a long moment. The crystals can regenerate, given time and proper alignment. But the process is. She hesitated, intensely painful. More painful than never walking again. Before Vasara could respond, something slammed against one of the sealed doors. Both women turned toward the sound, weapons raised. Through gaps in the metal, they glimpsed writhing tentacles and too many eyes. The mining must have awakened something, Nyx muttered. Or multiple somethings. We cannot stay here, Vasara said. The barriers won't hold long. Nyx made a quick decision. This is going to hurt, she warned, then grabbed Vasara's leg. With precise movements born of battlefield medicine training, she realigned the crystalline bones. The queen's scream echoed through the facility. The creatures outside responded with increased frenzy, battering the doors with renewed force. Move! Nyx pulled Vasara to her feet. The queen stumbled but managed to stay upright, leaning heavily on her former enemy as they fled through the opposite exit. They ran through darkened corridors, the sounds of pursuit growing closer. Nyx's mind raced, analyzing their options. The facility's layout was typical of syndicate operations, which meant. There. She spotted the maintenance shaft she'd been hoping for. Emergency escape route. Should lead to the surface. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for one person. Vasara looked at it dubiously. You expect me to climb? No, Nyx produced a length of cable from her salvaged supplies. I expect you to trust me again. Understanding dawned in the queen's eyes. You're going to pull me up. Unless you've got a better idea. The sounds of their pursuers grew closer. Vasara's scales shifted color, amusement, perhaps. My warriors would die of shame if they saw their queen now. Your warriors are dead, Nyx reminded her bluntly. And you'll be too if we don't move. Something changed in Vasara's expression at those words. She allowed Nyx to secure the cable around her waist, then watched as the human began climbing. The ascent was grueling. Nyx's arms burned as she pulled both their weights up the shaft, meter by agonizing meter. Below, Vasara maintained remarkable calm as tentacles reached for her feet, missing by centimeters. They emerged onto the moon's surface just as dawn broke over the artificial horizon. The landscape was otherworldly, crystal formations jutting from black sand, reflecting the light of distant stars. But they had no time to admire the view. The creatures, Vasara said urgently. They're still coming. Nyx scanned their surroundings, tactical mind working. There. She pointed to a crystalline outcropping. Those formations, they're similar to your biology, aren't they? Could you interface with them? Perhaps. Vasara's eyes widened with understanding. If I can access the crystal matrix, I might be able to trigger a resonance cascade. Like what my weapon did to your ship. Poetic justice, isn't it? The queen placed her hand against the crystal surface, which began to glow at her touch. But I'll need time. And power. Nyx checked her weapon's charge. How long? Minutes. No more. You'll have them. The creatures emerged from the shaft, twisted amalgamations of flesh and crystal that defied description. Nyx stood her ground, weapon ready, as Vasara worked to attune herself to the crystal matrix. The battle that followed was desperate. Nyx's shots found vulnerable points in the creatures' anatomies, but there seemed to be no end to them. She was down to her last power cell when Vasara called out. It's done. Brace yourself. The crystal formations began to vibrate, emitting a high-pitched tone that made Nyx's teeth ache. The creatures screamed, their bodies literally coming apart as the resonance built to impossible levels. Vasara collapsed, her own crystalline form struggling against the frequencies she'd unleashed. Without thinking, Nyx threw herself over the queen, shielding her as crystal shards filled the air like lethal rain. When it was over, the creatures were gone, reduced to component atoms by the resonance cascade. The surrounding crystal formations had shattered, leaving them in a field of glittering debris. Nyx rolled off Vasara, both of them breathing heavily. That, she said, was impressive. The queen turned to her, expression unreadable. You protected me. Why? Same reason you trusted me to pull you up that shaft. Because right now, we're all we've got. Vasara was quiet for a long moment. Perhaps, she said finally, I have misjudged your species. Yeah, well, Nyx helped her to her feet, maybe I've misjudged yours too. But we can have the cultural exchange later. Right now, we need to find a way off this rock before something worse shows up. The thing that emerged from beneath the black sand was a nightmare-given form. A crystalline leviathan that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its segmented body stretching hundreds of meters into the artificial sky. What did the syndicate do here? Nyx breathed, backing away slowly. Created their own doom, it seems, Vasara replied. Her silver eyes tracked the creature's movements with predatory focus. These crystals, they're not natural formations. They're failed experiments. The Leviathan turned toward them, revealing a maw large enough to swallow a shuttlecraft. Inside, smaller crystal formations pulsed with sickly light. We need to reach higher ground, Nyx said, noting how the creature's bulk seemed to hinder its mobility. That ridge dash. No time. Vasara shoved her aside as a crystalline tentacle slammed into the ground where they'd been standing. The impact shattered the surface, sending shockwaves through the moon's artificial core. They ran, the queen's injured leg slowing them considerably. Nyx fired backwards with her depleted weapon, shots barely scratching the creature's armored hide. The facility's power core, Vasara gasped as they took cover behind a fallen crystal spire. If it's still active dash. We could overload it, Nyx finished. But we'd need to get back inside. The Leviathan's roar shook loose debris from the facility's external structures. Its massive form began to sink back into the sand, disappearing from view. It's using the crystal matrix to move through solid matter, Vasara observed. The entire moon is its hunting ground. Then we better move fast. Nyx helped the queen up. Because I really don't want to be here when it surfaces again. They made their way back to the facility entrance, every step tense with anticipation. The ground occasionally trembled beneath their feet, the creature's movement creating subsurface waves in the black sand. Inside, the corridors were eerily silent. The smaller creatures had been destroyed by Vasara's resonance cascade, leaving only shadows and echoes. The core should be in the central chamber, Nyx said, recalling typical syndicate layouts. Assuming they didn't modify the standard design. They did not. Vasara's scales rippled with discomfort. I can feel the power signatures. The crystal matrices are connected. You mean the creature is connected to the facility systems? All of it is connected. The experiments, the core, the creature, they created a single massive organism. Nyx processed this information as they moved deeper into the facility. That's why the resonance weapon affected your ship so badly. Your people's technology, it's based on the same principles. Yes. Vasara's admission seemed to cost her. We discovered the Syndicate's research decades ago. Adapted it, perfected it. Our living ships are the result. And now their original experiment wants to kill us both. Fantastic. They reached the core chamber, a vast spherical space dominated by a pulsing crystal structure that seemed to breathe with otherworldly energy. Nyx immediately moved to the control systems while Vasara studied the core itself. The containment protocols are still active, Nyx reported. But I can't access them without proper authorization. Step aside. Vasara placed her hand on the console. Her crystalline biology interfaced with the systems, creating a bridge between technologies. The codes are similar to ARG. The Queen recoiled as feedback surged through the connection. At the same moment, the facility shuddered violently. It knows we're here, Vasara gasped. It's coming. The walls began to shift, crystal formations growing like cancer through metal and composite materials. The Leviathan was reshaping the facility from within. How long can you hold the connection? Nyx demanded, supporting Vasara as she swayed. Minutes at most. The feedback, it's trying to subsume my consciousness into the greater matrix. Then let's make those minutes count. Nyx's fingers flew over the console, using Vasara's connection to bypass security protocols. I'm initiating a controlled overload. When I give the signal, sever the connection and run. The Queen's scales had taken on a sickly pallor, but her voice remained steady. You assume we'll be fast enough to escape the blast radius. You got a better idea? A crystalline tendril burst through the floor, nearly impaling them. More followed, the chamber becoming a forest of lethal spikes. The escape pods, Vasara said suddenly. There must be maintenance pods in a facility this size. Nyx checked the facility schematics. Maintenance bay, 2 levels up. If they're still operational dash. They will be. The creature wants to preserve potential resources. Vasara's eyes were unfocused, information flowing through her connection. It's been waiting for new subjects to experiment on. That's not creepy at all. Nyx finished the overload sequence. Ready? The Queen nodded grimly. Now. Vasara broke the connection as Nyx triggered the overload. They ran from the chamber as crystal formations exploded behind them, the creature's rage manifesting in twisted architectures of light and shadow. The journey to the maintenance bay was a nightmare of shifting corridors and deadly beauty. The facility seemed to rebuild itself around them, trying to trap them in a crystalline maze. They found the maintenance pods exactly where expected, small utility craft designed for external repairs. Most were crushed or fused with crystal growths, but one remained intact. It's closing off our escape routes, Vasara reported, her connection to the crystal matrix giving her insight into the creature's actions. We have moments at most. Nyx practically threw the Queen into the pod before climbing in herself. The controls were Syndicate standard, not so different from the mining equipment she'd once used on Saturn's moons. The pod's engines whined to life just as crystal formations began growing across its viewport. They launched through a maintenance airlock that was literally closing around them, crystal teeth trying to snag their small craft. Behind them, the facility's power core went critical. The explosion was spectacular, a cascade of energy that shattered the creature's crystalline form into billions of glittering fragments. The shockwave caught their pod, sending it tumbling end over end through space. When they finally stabilized, both women stared at the destruction they'd left behind. The artificial moon was breaking apart, its surface cracking like an egg to reveal the twisted beauty of its crystalline interior. Your empire, Nyx said quietly. They need to know about this. About what the Syndicate was doing out here. Yes. Vasara's voice held new conviction. Perhaps it's time for the Centauri to reconsider many things. Including our relationship with humanity. Starting with us. The Queen turned to her, silver eyes reflecting starlight. You saved my life. Multiple times. Even when leaving me to die would have been easier. Yeah, well. Nyx focused on plotting a course away from the dying moon. Maybe I'm tired of easy choices. As am I. Vasara's hand found hers on the controls. Together then. Together, Nyx agreed. At least until we figure out how to explain all this to your empire. And your resistance? One impossible task at a time, your majesty. As their small pod carried them toward uncertain destiny, both women knew that something fundamental had changed. Not just between them, but in the very fabric of human-Centauri relations. Whether that change would bring peace or more conflict remained to be seen. But for now, they had survived. Together. And sometimes, that was enough to start a revolution. The Centauri High Council chamber was silent as Queen Visara finished her testimony. The crystalline architecture amplified every small movement, making the tension almost palpable. Commander Nyx Blackthorn stood beside the Queen, her presence unprecedented in this sacred space. "You expect us to believe," First Minister Calix said, his scales darkening with skepticism, "that this human saved your life? That the Syndicate's forbidden experiments threaten our very way of life? I expect you to see the truth before you," Visara replied. Her silver eyes swept the chamber. "Our empire is built on stolen technology we barely understand. The same forces that corrupted that mining facility are present in every ship, every colony we've established." Murmurs rippled through the assembled council members. Nyx watched them carefully, noting which ones seemed receptive and which remained hostile. The fate of two species might depend on this moment. The human resistance, Visara continued, has developed countermeasures to crystal technology. Not just weapons, but safeguards. Protections against the kind of corruption we witnessed. And you propose an alliance? Another council member sneered. With these primitives? Careful, Nyx spoke for the first time, her voice carrying in the acoustic chamber. This primitive helped your queen walk again when her own people thought her dead. And we've been researching crystal matrices longer than you think. She produced a data crystal, salvaged from the mining facility's records. This contains evidence of early human experiments with crystal tech. We abandoned it when we saw the dangers. Your people found the research and rushed ahead without understanding the consequences. Visara nodded. The resonance weapon that damaged my flagship wasn't just a weapon. It was a purification protocol, designed to cleanse corrupted crystal matrices. Why should we trust anything you say? Calix demanded. You return after being presumed dead, accompanied by our enemy, spouting heresy about our sacred technology. Because, a new voice rang out, she speaks truth. All eyes turned to the chamber entrance where an elderly Centauri stood. His scales were pale with age, but his bearing was regal. Father. Visara's voice held surprise and relief. The former emperor had been in seclusion for years, his opinions still highly regarded by the council. I warned against rapid expansion, the elder said, moving to stand beside his daughter. Against relying too heavily on technology we didn't fully comprehend. Now we face the consequences of our haste. He turned to Nyx, studying her with ancient eyes. You saved my daughter. She saved me too, Nyx replied simply. We saved each other. As it should be. He addressed the council. I have seen the signs of corruption in our newest colonies. Crystal formations growing wild, ships behaving erratically. We stand on the brink of disaster. Calix rose, his scales flaring. You propose we trust humans? After all they've done to resist us? We propose, Visara said firmly, that we work together to prevent catastrophe. The corruption spreads. Without human insight into crystal technology, our empire will fall to the same fate as that mining facility. And what do humans want in return? A younger council member asked. Peace, Nyx answered. Recognition of our sovereign territories. And partnership in developing safe applications of crystal tech. She managed a small smile. Turns out your queen can be quite persuasive when she's not trying to conquer you. Visara's scales rippled with amusement, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the council. The relationship between queen and former enemy was clearly more complex than simple political alliance. The debate raged for hours. Nyx stood steadfast beside Visara, their shoulders occasionally brushing in subtle support. Finally, the council reached its decision. "We will consider this alliance," Calyx announced grudgingly. "Under strict conditions. A joint commission will be established to study the corruption. Human territories will be respected while negotiations proceed." "And Commander Blackthorn?" Visara asked, tension in her voice. "Will be granted diplomatic status," the First Minister conceded. "As our first human advisor on crystal technology." Later, in Visara's private chambers, Nyx finally allowed herself to relax. "That went better than expected. Though I think some of them still want me executed. Many things are changing." Visara moved to stand beside her at the viewport, where crystal ships glittered in orbit. "My father's support was unexpected. He loves you. And he's wise enough to see the bigger picture." Nyx turned to face her. "What happens now?" Now, Visara's scales shifted to deep blues and purples, colors Nyx had learned indicated both determination and affection. "We build something new. Together. Your people won't like that last part. They will adapt. As we did." The Queen's hand found hers, crystalline fingers intertwining with human ones. "You taught me that strength comes in many forms. That enemies can become." She paused, searching for the right word. "Partners?" Nyx suggested. "More than partners." Visara's free hand traced the line of Nyx's jaw. "You humans have a saying, actions speak louder than words. Let us show both our peoples what is possible when old hatreds are set aside." As their lips met, somewhere in the vastness of space, a new crystal formation began to grow. But this one was different, a perfect fusion of human insight and Centauri power, free from corruption. A symbol of what two species could achieve together. The war was over. The real work, of healing, understanding, and building a shared future, was just beginning. But for now, in this moment, a former slave and a warrior queen held each other close, their unlikely love a beacon of hope for two civilizations on the brink of transformation. Change, like the crystals themselves, would grow from this seed. And this time, it would grow true.